the Rock and Roll Unraveled Show. I'm Derek Shelmadine. Welcome to another Rock and Roll Unraveled Show. We're taking a look at the first group to have the accolade of supergroup. That was guitarist EricClapton, bassist JackBruce, and drummer GingerBaker, and collectively they were known as Cream. They all came to the group with some very, very impressive backgrounds. But before we start, just a reminder, there'll be an opportunity to win a copy of my book, Rock and Roll Unraveled. But more about that later in the show. I'll also be announcing the winner of our first competition last month and giving you the question for this month's competition. But to begin our story, we'll take a look at what the lads were up to before they came together. Then some of the highlights of Cream's short but illustrious career. To put Cream into rock and roll context, when they started out in July '66, beat music was morphing into the much harder-edged rock music. And the beat groups of the first half of the '60s, well, I mean, they were fading away. The ones who continued to find success tended to be the bands that wrote their own material, people like the Beatles, the Stones, the Kinks. And of course, the British invasion had a major part to play on all this. That was 1964 to 1966, and that was when British actors dominated the American music scene. And they were led very much by the Beatles and Stones. The Beatles had 31 Billboard Top 40s across that period, 12 of which made number one. And the Stones had 13 Billboard Top 40s, and 3 of theirs reached the highest position the chart could offer. Now, in an earlier show, we looked at how Merseybeat bands dominated the first wave of the British invasion. And to hear that, just go to podcasts on my website, rockandrollunraveled.com. Well, the times, they were certainly a-changing. In the UK, at the end of '65, The Who, well, they were lamenting the desire in my generation to die before I get old. And The Move, they formed at the beginning of '66, a sort of brummy supergroup. And Pink Floyd were getting underway. They had their first single at the beginning of 1967. And in the US, things were really getting interesting. On the East Coast, Velvet Underground had their first gig with Nico as the lead singer at the beginning of 1966. And on the West Coast, the Grateful Dead in the beginning of '66 had just changed their name from the Warlocks. And the 13th Floor Elevators in February of '66, well, they received a review which described them as psychedelic. And that was one of the first reviews to refer to a band as psychedelic. And the Doors started their legendary residency at LA's Whiskey A Go-Go in the May of 1966 and signed to Elektra in the August. Now, Cream were at the vanguard of this new fangled rock music, and some of the bands were experimenting more with psychedelic rock, but Cream, well, they were firmly based in the blues. Although they did get into the whole psychedelia thing, particularly in their second album. But I thought to kick the show off, we'd have a track from that blues icon, Robert Johnson. Now, he only ever recorded 2 sessions, one in San Antonio in November 1936, where he recorded 16 songs, and another one 6-7 months later in the June of 1937 in Dallas, where he recorded a further 13 songs. And the one we're going to start off with is Crossroad Blues from that San Antonio session on the 23rd November 1936. Now, Robert Johnson died on the 16th of August 1938 after apparently being poisoned by a jealous husband. And he's said to have gained his genius after he sold his soul to the devil. And at Highway 49, if you're travelling through Clarksdale, you'll come to Highway 61. And that's the crossroads that's believed to be where the meeting with the devil took place. And if ever you're travelling past that particular intersection, you'll see a pair of crossed guitars and the words Crossroads written underneath them. Now, Cream covered this particular song, Crossroad Blues, as Crossroads on their Wheels of Fire album in 1968. But this is Robert Johnson with the original version of Crossroad Blues. We'll start by taking a look at the individuals. Eric Clapton. We'll look at JackBruce and GingerBaker together because their paths crisscross a lot on the road to Cream. And then we'll take a look at some of the highlights of Cream's short but illustrious career. Well, let's kick off with Eric Clapton. He was born in Ripley, in Surrey, on the 30th of March 1945. And in the early part of 1963, joined the Roosters. That was with Tom McGuinness and Ben Palmer, who will crop up a lot in this story. And Brian Jones of Rolling Stones fame, he's known to have sat in with the Roosters from time to time. Now, towards the end of the year, the Roosters folded, and Eric Clapton and Tom McGuinness joined Casey Jones and the Engineers. Now, Casey Jones was actually Liverpool's Brian Casser, and he was the guy that put together Cass and the Casanovas. Now, famously, Eric Clapton was only with Casey Jones and the Engineers for about 7 gigs. He found them a little bit too pop-orientated, and he went off and joined the Yardbirds. And Tom McGuinness followed in early 1964, and he joined Manfred Mann just around the time they were achieving success with 54321. And in October 1963, Clapton replaced original guitarist Topham in the Yardbirds. Now, Topham was only about 16 at this time, and the band was finding a lot of fame. It really were getting popular on the R&B circuit, and it meant that the Yardbirds were turning professional. And the other guys are that little bit older than Topham, and Topham's parents pretty much against him becoming a professional musician. They wanted him to get a proper job. And anyway, he decided he'd quit the group and continue on with his studies. And just a little later than this, the Yardbirds had taken over from the Rolling Stones as the house band at the Crawdaddy Club in Richmond in West London. And on the 7th and 8th of December, both nights' performances were recorded by their manager, Giorgio Gomelski, and the second night was with blues legend Sonny Boy Williamson the second, and that actually resulted in an album, Sonny Boy Williamson and the Yardbirds. That was released a couple of years later. And in February '64, they were sort of back in the studio, as it were, this time with the R.and Jones studio in Morden, and they were produced by Mike Vernon. Now, he's the guy that founded the Blue Horizon record label, and they started their residency at the Marquee in central London on the 6th of February. Now, their manager, Giorgio Gomelski, he was a guy that was really a major player in the London scene at this time. He knew the Marquee's owner, Harold Pendleton, got them the gig. Now, Giorgio Gomelski, as well as being the Yardbirds manager, he produced all their recordings. And he was also the Rolling Stones' first manager until Andrew Luke Oldham came along, saw the Stones the Crawdaddy, and thought, I think I'll have a bit of this. And they went off and worked for Andrew Luke Oldham after that. But in 1966, Gomelski actually formed his own record label, the Marmalade label. And at the end of October, the Yardbirds released their second single, Good Morning Little Schoolgirl, gave them their first UK hit. They scored a number 44 with that one. And in December, they released their first album, 5 Live Yardbirds. And that was recorded at the Marquee on the 13th of March that year. Around the March 1965, Eric Clapton decided it was time to move on again. On the 5th of March, they released their third UK single, For Your Love, coupled with Got to Hurry. And this was the last single with Eric Clapton. Now, For Your Love was written by Graham Gouldman, but the B-side, Got to Hurry, was credited to O. Rasputin. And O. Rasputin was actually Giorgio Gomelski, a man of many talents. And the band credit on the label's interesting as well. That says, Yardbirds featuring Eric Slowhand Clapton. But once again, the band had proved too pop-oriented for Eric Clapton's taste, and he moved on and joined the Blues Breakers as John Mayall's Blues Breakers, and Jeff Beck came in and replaced him as lead guitarist in the Yardbirds. Now, not long after he joined John Mayall's Blues Breakers, he decided it was time for a sabbatical. So in the summer of 1965, he formed a band called the Glands, sort of loose collection of musicians. It did include Ben Palmer, who he'd been with in the Roosters, and the plan was to play their way across Europe and beyond. But they only managed to get as far as Greece, where they were blackmailed by a club owner for working without permits. It made their escape eventually, but Clapton did lose his amp in the process. Now, in the September of '65, JackBruce played his first gig with John Mayall's Blues Breakers. Eric Clapton was still away in Greece at the time, but JackBruce was still in the band when Eric Clapton came back from Greece. And in the October, the Blues Breakers released I'm Your Witch Doctor, now featured Eric Clapton, and produced by Jimmy Page, later of Led Zeppelin fame, and released by Andrew Loog Oldham on his Immediate record label. Now, in early November, Clapton returned from Greece and rejoined John Mayall. And he actually replaced Peter Green, who'd only joined the Blues Breakers a week earlier. And the lineup by now was John Mayall, Eric Clapton, JackBruce, and Huey Flint on drums. This was the first time that Clapton played alongside JackBruce, but JackBruce actually left shortly after Clapton rejoined the Blues Breakers, and he left and joined, surprisingly, Manfred Mann. Now, if you're an Eric Clapton fan, there's an album that's well worth tracking down. It was released in mid-1966, originally released in America as a Various Artists album, What's Shaking. It has been released in the UK, and in the UK it was called Good Time Music. And it was released as Eric Clapton and the Powerhouse, and they contributed 3 tracks to this Elektra album. It was essentially a one-off studio project, but I've seen references to the odd gig by Eric Clapton and the Powerhouse. And the Powerhouse was essentially another sort of supergroup, as well as Clapton from John Mayall's Blues Breakers. Ben Palmer played piano, and he'd been with Clapton and the Glands and the Roosters. And from Manfred Mann, JackBruce was on bass, and Paul Jones harmonica. And from Spencer Davis Group, Pete York was the drummer, and Steve Winwood provided the vocals, but he was billed on the album as Steve Anglo for contractual reasons. Now, they contributed 3 tracks, Stepping Out, which was popularised by Memphis Slim in the late 50s. I Want to Know, and the writing credit there goes to Sheila MacLeod, who was married to Paul Jones at the time, and it's often thought that Paul Jones contributed quite a bit to the writing of that particular track. And of course, the ubiquitous Crossroads turned up on the album. And we heard that at the beginning of the show, Robert Johnson from 1936, and Cream again covered it as Crossroads on their Wheels of Fire album in '68. But on the 22nd of July 1966, John Mayall released Blues Breakers with Eric Clapton. And that again was produced by Mike Vernon, and that was the lineup from above: Eric Clapton, Huey Flint, John McVie, and John Mayall. And about the time that the album was released, Eric Clapton left the Blues Breakers to form Cream, and once again Peter Green came in and replaced Eric Clapton. Well, before leaving this look at Eric Clapton, I think it's only fair to take a look back at Ben Palmer. Now, if you remember, Ben Palmer's been associated with Clapton right along the way here. He was with Clapton in the very early days in the Roosters, and then he joined him again in the Glands for his ill-fated trip to Greece. And following that, he was part of Eric Clapton and the Powerhouse when he played piano on that Various Artists album, What's Shaking. Now, when Eric Clapton went off and formed Cream, who should join them as roadie but aforesaid Ben Palmer. So he's a character that's certainly been long associated with Eric Clapton. For our second piece of music, I thought we'd go back to the Blues Breakers with Eric Clapton album. And that's the one with the album cover with the four guys sitting down and Eric Clapton famously reading the Beano comic book. And from the album, this is John Mayall and the Blues Breakers with Key to Love. You're listening to Derek Shelmerdine with the Rock and Roll Unraveled show. We're taking a look at the story of Cream, how they came together and their brilliant, albeit brief, career. But before continuing with the story, there's an opportunity to win a copy of my book, Rock and Roll Unraveled. Just answer the simple question about Cream. Which iconic London venue did Cream choose for their famous farewell concerts on the 26th of November, 1968? Now, the book, Rock and Roll Unraveled, tells a story of rock and roll from its roots through to mid-1970s punk, not just the music, but the social events which shaped the sounds of the times, the Vietnam War, the civil rights struggle, and much more. Now, that question again. Which iconic London venue did Cream choose for their famous farewell concerts on the 26th of November, 1968? Now, to enter, simply go to my website, rockandrollunraveled.com, that's unraveled with a single L, and go to contacts, send me an email with your answer, and the winner will be announced on the next show on the 1st of April. I'll post the book to the lucky winner anywhere in the world. Now, we have a winner from last month, and the guy that answered the Buddy Holly question correctly was Terry Edwards from the UK. Well done, Terry. Look forward to getting your book in the post absolutely immediately. Good luck with the competition. If you listen to the show after the closing date of the 1st of April, no problem. Just go to my homepage at rockandrollunraveled.com. There's a different competition there every month, so just follow the links, answer the current question, and win your signed copy of Rock and Roll Unraveled. Well, meanwhile, back at the plot, time to have a little look at JackBruce and GingerBaker, see what they were up to. Well, JackBruce was born in Bishopsbriggs, Lanarkshire, Scotland, on the 14th of May 1943, and he learned the cello and composition at a very early age. And in the late 50s, early 60s, he was with the Murray Campbell Big Band playing double bass. Now, he moved down to London in 1962 and joined Alexis Corner's Blues Incorporated playing double bass. And there's a fabulous 1962 photo with the line of Dave Stevens piano, Dick Hexel-Smith sax, Alexis Corner guitar, JackBruce on double bass, Mick Jagger, future Rolling Stones frontman, on vocals, and Cyril Davis on harmonica. Now, you can't actually see the drummer in the photo, but that was almost certainly Charlie Watts, who also went on and joined the Rolling Stones. Now, GingerBaker was born in Lewisham in London on the 19th of August 1939. And in his early days, he made his own drum kit by bending perspex into cylinders over his gas stove. And urban legend has it that the kit met its end during one of Baker's onstage bust-ups with JackBruce. Now, GingerBaker was very much a pioneer of the double bass drum kit and led the way to extended drum solos. I mean, he's got his epic drum solo, Toad. In 1956, GingerBaker joined the Storyville Jazzmen, and he was later with Terry Lightfoot's jazz band. In early 1963, he joined Alexis Corner's Blues Incorporated, where he replaced Charlie Watts. Charlie Watts went off and joined the Rolling Stones in January 1963, and the lineup included GingerBaker, JackBruce, Graham Bond, and Dick Hexel-Smith. Now, in February, GingerBaker, Graham Bond, and JackBruce left Alexis Corner, and they formed the Graham Bond trio. And the great story, urban legend has it that Bond approached Alexis Corner, told him the three of them were leaving, and that was the first that they heard of it. JackBruce and GingerBaker, they didn't realise they'd left until they were actually out of the band and in Graham Bond's trio. On the 20th of February, they recorded I Saw Her Standing There with Duffy Power. That's the Lennon McCartney song. And Duffy Power was backed by the Graham Bond Quartet. Now, two versions of the song were recorded. First one with a lineup of Graham Bond, JackBruce, GingerBaker, and future Mahavishnu Orchestra guitarist and founding member John McLaughlin. But when they came to record the song again, the session on the 20th of March, John McLaughlin wasn't available. So his place was taken by session guitarist Big Jim Sullivan. The song was coupled with Graham Bond composition Farewell Baby and released in May as Duffy Power's 8th UK single. Duffy Power was one of these guys at the time, tremendous critical acclaim, but very little commercial success. And in the January '65, the Graham Bond organisation backed Chuck Berry on his UK tour. Then in September, JackBruce left the Graham Bond organisation. He was sacked after a series of arguments with GingerBaker. But he continued to turn up at gigs, plucky little fellow. And that was until GingerBaker allegedly, he says loudly, pulled a knife on him and suggested that, well, enough was enough. Now that was when JackBruce went off and joined John Mayall's Blues Breakers. So he was in the band while EricClapton was still away in Greece. But he left Blues Breakers shortly after Mayall's return, and he joined Manfred Mann at his first gig with them in the November. In April 1966, Manfred Mann released Pretty Flamingo. Now that was the final single with singer Paul Jones, and it's the only Manfred Mann single to feature JackBruce on bass. He parted company with Manfred Mann shortly afterwards. In the June, he had his last gig with them, and he went off and joined the other lads in Cream. Meanwhile, GingerBaker was still with the Graham Bond organisation, and on the 14th of March 1966, The Who released Substitute, coupled with a B-side, Waltz for a Pig. That's a really interesting story. The Substitute itself had 3 different B-sides. It was the follow-up to My Generation. It was the first single that the Who released on their new Reaction label. Now, the previous 2 versions of Substitute were released with a B-side, Circles and Instant Party, which in reality were both the same song. Now, Shel Talmy had been their previous producer at Brunswick, and they'd already recorded Instant Party while they were there. And Talmy took a very dim view of The Who re-recording the song for their new record label. Now, he made his point by releasing his version of Instant Party as the B-side of A Legal Matter. And to right the wrong, he obtained an injunction which stopped sales and prevented The Who from recording. So rather than have the sales for Substitute stall, they released the 3rd version of the single and changed the B-side to Waltz for a Pig. Now, the artist credited on the B-side was the Who Orchestra, and the writing credit went to Harry Butcher. Now, the Who Orchestra in reality was Graham Bond organisation, and the line-up included Graham Bond and GingerBaker. And Harry Butcher, the accredited writer, was actually GingerBaker. Now, in mid-1966, GingerBaker left the Graham Bond organisation to form Cream. Now, the other 3 tracks on the show are all pretty much heavy blues-based songs, so I thought it might be quite nice to hear JackBruce in a mellow mood. And this is his only appearance on a Manfred Mann single, so if you're a JackBruce completist, you need this Manfred Mann single in your collection, and this is Pretty Flamingo. There's a load of detail in the show, as there always is when you're unraveling rock and roll. To check it out at your leisure, see the associated blog of the show. And the blog's also got links to all the songs mentioned in the show, not just the 4 songs that we play. And that's at rockandrollunraveled.com. Well, how did they all come together? Eric Clapton sat in on a Graham Bond gig with Ginger Baker at the Flamingo Club in London, and Ginger Baker really rated Eric Clapton. And in sort of May or June, he returned the favour, and Eric Clapton was playing with John Mayall's Blues Breakers in Oxford, and Ginger Baker sat in with them. Afterwards, Ginger Baker asked Eric Clapton if he fancied starting a band, and he insisted, Clapton, that JackBruce joined them. Now, Eric Clapton had no idea of the history between JackBruce and Ginger Baker. Anyway, it all happened. And I mean, Eric Clapton had previously played with JackBruce and had really rated him when they were in John Mayall's Blues Breakers. After Eric returned from his summer jaunt in Greece, well, they played a warm-up gig at the Twisted Wheel in Manchester, and on the 31st of July, they made their official debut at the 6th National Jazz and Blues Festival in Windsor, and they were on the same bill as Georgie Fame, The Action, and Alan Bown. Now, on the 1st of October, Jimi Hendrix famously jammed with Cream at a Cream gig at the Central London Polytechnic, and they were supported by the Washington DCs. Now, Chas Chandler, formerly the Animals bass player, he'd recently taken over management of Jimi Hendrix and brought him to the UK to form a band. And Chandler introduced Jimi Hendrix to Eric Clapton, and he jammed on stage, and they played Howlin' Wolf's Killing Floor. That was a single from Howlin' Wolf in 1965. And the urban legend has it that Eric Clapton was so dismayed afterwards, he nearly backed it all in because he just thought Jimi Hendrix was just, wow, so good. And also in the October, they released their first single, Wrapping Paper, and that was coupled with Cat Squirrel. Now, Wrapping Paper was written by JackBruce and lyricist Pete Brown, and they were the songwriting team for most of the Cream songs, but most of the ones that were original, because they did an awful lot of blues covers, and it was produced by their manager, Robert Stigwood. Now, the writer for Cat Squirrel's listed as traditional arranged S Splurge. Now, S Splurge was the band. That was Eric Clapton, JackBruce, and Ginger Baker. It made a UK number 34, though it never troubled the American charts. In December, they released their first UK album, Fresh Cream. That was produced by Robert Stigwood as well, and that made number 6 on the albums charts. And also in December, in the UK, they released I Feel Free, and that was released in America at the beginning of January. That was their first American single, and it was on the Atco label. That's a subsidiary of Atlantic. They had a hit in the UK with I Feel Free at number 11, but again, that didn't trouble the American charts any. But on the 25th of March, they opened their first American concerts, and they were billed as direct from England, and it was DJ Murray the K's live in person Music of the Fifth Dimension package show, and this was 9 consecutive days of 5 shows a day at the RKO Theatre in New York. That was a busy time. Multiple acts, people like The Who, Wilson Pickett, Smokey Robinson, Mitch Ryder, even Murray the K's wife with dancers billed as Jackie and the K-Girls. The shows themselves were pretty poorly attended, and very, very short performances from the bands, with a number of acts not even bothering to turn up. But The Who gave storming performances, and they had a crowd-pleasing demolition of their equipment 5 times a day. They were unknown in America at that particular time, but they did crack the American market at Monterey a couple of months later. Well, that ended on the 2nd of April, and the following day they were in Atlantic Records, New York studios, to start recording for their second album. Disraeli Gears was released as their second UK album on the 2nd of November and released in the US a month later. And that's got an acclaimed psychedelic album with tracks like Sunshine of Your Love, written, as you'd expect, by JackBruce and Pete Brown, but this one with a little assistance from Eric Clapton. On the 7th of March 1968, they recorded Toad for the Wheels of Fire album. That was at the Fillmore West in San Francisco. Now, Toad's a major drum solo of Ginger Baker's, and Drum solos were not really a big thing in rock music at the time. They were a standard feature, though, of jazz and big band music. And you'd get stunning percussion displays from the likes of Louis Belson, Elvin Jones, Gene Krupa, and Buddy Rich. We actually had a pop drum hero, Sandy Nelson, and he had a top 10 on both sides of the pond with Teen Beat in 1959. And people like Keith Moon from The Who and Mitch Mitchell from Jimi Hendrix, that really helped to establish the prominence of drummers in rock bands. And Ginger Baker very much led the way to double bass drum kits and extended drum solos. And these solos became much loved by prog and hard rock bands. But in the May, well, pretty much 2 years from the time they came together, Cream made the decision to split up. And this was halfway through their second American tour. I mean, the reasons were complicated and many. I mean, partly resentment over royalties, composer credits, increasing volumes. JackBruce eventually succumbed to tinnitus. And clashing egos on stage. I mean, personal tensions, to say the least, between JackBruce and Ginger Baker, and the pair had never really got on. And Eric Clapton, times were changing for him. His values were changing after listening to the American group The Band, their basement tapes and music from the Big Pink, and he wanted a much subtler sound. And he was also tired of having to be the guitar hero for the fans. He wanted something much less pressured. And JackBruce put a lot of the breakup down to a really bad review in Rolling Stone in the May, and the review really hit the group's confidence. And he was becoming bored with the trio formula. I mean, he was the group's main songwriter. And he wanted to be more adventurous. He was writing more complex arrangements with horns, and he felt really that the group had plateaued musically. Well, on the 13th of July, the headline came in Melody Maker, Cream split up. And in the official statement, they announced an American tour from the 4th of October to the 4th of November, 18 gigs. But in the UK, there was just one appearance announced, and that was their famous farewell performance, 2 shows at the Royal Albert Hall. The Wheels of Fire double album was released in the August. It had a live platter and a studio platter. And again, it was produced by Felix Peppelardi, who produced all of their albums after the first one, produced by Robert Stigwood. And he actually, Pappalardi, played on various tracks on the studio album. He played viola and trumpet, and he went on to form Mountain with guitarist Leslie West. And in the August, JackBruce recorded his Things We Like album, and that was released in 1970. That was after the release of his first solo album, Songs for a Tailor, and the lineup on that album included John McLaughlin, John Heisman, and Dick Hexel Smith. Well, their final tour opened on the 4th of October in Oakland, California. On the 19th, they recorded the live portion of Goodbye at the Forum in Los Angeles, and this final American tour closed on the 4th of November with their final American gig at Rhode Island Auditorium. Now there they were supported by Terry Reid, the guy who famously turned down the opportunity to be Led Zeppelin's frontman. And their farewell UK performance came on the 26th of November 1968 at the Royal Albert Hall. They played 2 concerts and were supported by Yes and Taste. Well, in March 69, the Goodbye album was released, but by the time it hit the shops, the lads had all gone their separate ways. Goodbye was actually originally intended to be a double album, another sort of Wheels of Fire, half studio, half live, but that never happened. But one of the studio tracks, Badge, was actually written by Clapton and George Harrison of Beatles fame, and Harrison performed on the recording as well and credited as L'Angelo Misterioso. What a great name. Now, Eric Clapton and Ginger Baker went on to form Blind Faith, and they debuted on the 7th of June at Hyde Park in the UK, and they played their last ever concert very shortly afterwards on the 24th of August in Hawaii. I mean, so much promise to implode so quickly. I mean, the lineup was incredible. It was Eric Clapton and Ginger Baker from Cream, Steve Winwood from Spencer Davis Group and a founding member of Traffic, and bass player Rick Gretsch, who was a founding member of Family. JackBruce released his first solo album on the 29th of August, and that was the Songs for a Tailor. And subsequently, 1993, they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. That was an induction as Cream, but it wasn't Eric Clapton's first induction. The year before, he'd been inducted with the Yardbirds, and in 2000 he was inducted for a third time as a solo artist. And on that Cream induction in 93, they actually played, which would have been brilliant, Sunshine of Your Love, Crossroads, and Born Under a Bad Sign. And they did have some more reunion concerts, famously in 2005. In the May, they did 4 gigs at the Royal Albert Hall, and the October, 3 gigs at Madison Square Garden. But even though there was some talk of them doing more gigs and a tour after that, by the time they'd played together for this 2 series of gigs, they were at each other's throats again. And basically, that was it. Now, that was Cream. I've been Derek Shelmerdine. You've been listening to the Rock and Roll Unraveled show and the story of one of the titans of rock music, Cream. Hope you've enjoyed listening to the show half as much as I have in putting the whole thing together. If you're in social media, check me out on Twitter at RNR Unraveled and Facebook at Rock and Roll Unraveled. If you see a theme developing here, remember there's a copy of my book, Rock and Roll Unraveled, and you can win it by answering the question, which iconic London venue did Cream choose for their famous farewell concert on the 26th of November 1968? Well, simply go to my website, rockandrollunraveled.com, go to contacts, send me an email with your answer. And the winner will be announced on the next show on April the 1st. And I'll be posting the book to the lucky winner anywhere in the world. And good luck with the competition. If you're listening to the show after the closing date of the 1st of April, no problem. Just go to my homepage, rockandrollunraveled.com. There's a different competition every month. Just follow the links and answer the current question. Well, I hope you can join me next time for another look at a little piece of rock and roll unraveled. Now, to play us out, and probably the only time I'll ever do this, play the same song twice. Well, not quite the same song. We opened with Robert Johnson's original Crossroad Blues, and we're going to close with the Cream's version. They called it Crossroads, and it's on the Wheels of Fire album. I mean, listen to the awesome bass line here from JackBruce. In fact, the drums, bass, and guitar are all distinctive, and they're all giving it plenty of welly. And this is the awesome Cream with Crossroads.